Okay, folks, I think we're going to get started. First of all, thank you to everyone for coming out on a Monday afternoon at lunch. It's great to have you all here. I'm Jessie Brunner. I'm the program associate at the Wsdl Honda Center for Human Rights and International Justice over in Humanities and Sciences. We're very pleased to be partnering with Stanford Law School's Center for Internet and Society today for this exciting event. I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer Granick, who's the Director of Civil Liberties there, who will introduce herself and our speaker, Mr. Shetty from Amnesty International. So, thanks.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for coming. I'm Jennifer Granick. I'm the Director of Civil Liberties at the Center for Internet and Society. And for those of you who are law students here, you probably already know a little bit about the center. We're a public interest internet law program here at the law school. And we look at the ways that different things that regulate the internet or regulate digital technology affect civil liberties and human rights like freedom of expression, privacy, and innovation. And one of the areas that we study very closely is the idea of intermediary liability. We think intermediary liability is very important because in the modern world, so much of what we can do, so much of what we can learn, so much of what we can say, so much of whether our information is kept private or not, is decided by the policies and practices of private entities, of companies and platforms like Facebook or Google, and of technology designers like Apple or Android. So for this reason, I'm very excited to be able to welcome Salil Shetty from Amnesty International today for this talk on the role that private companies play in protecting human rights. Mr. Shetty is the Secretary General of Amnesty International, which is global, maybe one of the premier global human rights organizations. And he has a background in poverty and justice issues. Amnesty and Mr. Shetty are known for working on issues involving government abuse of human rights, from whether it's torture or imprisonment or those sorts of things, and exposing those abuses by governments. But I think that his talk today will be particularly interesting because it will reflect that realization and that challenge that so much of what we do as civil liberties and human rights is dependent not only on what governments do, but also on what private entities do as well. So with that, I'd like you guys to join me, please, in welcoming Mr. Shetty for this talk today.
I just want to start by, first of all, thanking Jessie and the Honda Center for hosting us here today, and Professor Granick from the Center for Internet and Society. So thank you all for. Are you all able to hear me? No? No? Is it better? Can you hear me? No.
You have an on a little.
So, I can hear it. It's probably just not loud.
Oh, yes.
Up to the best of volume. That's good. Okay, I think this should be better.
The internet lawyers are good at this. Thank you.
I'll try and project my voice if I can. I've spent the last week here in Silicon Valley, and we are increasing our sort of interface with Silicon Valley as we speak, and I'm therefore very happy and grateful for this opportunity to address this important subject right in the middle of the digital nerve center of the world, which is Stanford and Silicon Valley. But at the outset, before we go into the substance of the discussion, I wanted to put things a little bit in context. It's, I think, very important to put the attack of the right to privacy online within a broader context. And in recent years, in my view, young people, women, minorities, and other vulnerable groups have been increasingly standing up for their rights, empowered by their access to new information and communication tools, much of it enabled by technology. The speed and scalability of mobilizing ideas and people through mobile phones and the internet is unprecedented. And this, in my view, has caught unaccountable governments and even corporations entirely off guard. More often than not, their reaction has been to suppress even peaceful protests on the streets and Maidans or online with disproportionate force and heavy-handedness. This is not the story only of the Arab Spring, but from Hong Kong to Burundi to Brazil, curbing dissent and protest has been more than normal. Last year alone, Amnesty International's annual State of the World's Human Rights Report revealed that at least 113 countries had restricted freedom of expression. So the curbing of digital rights is a key part of this unfortunate debate. Now, since Snowden's explosive revelations almost 3 years ago, there's almost no week that goes by without some news story on government surveillance hitting the headlines. Last Friday, media reported that Facebook's free basic services was blocked in Egypt after the company refused the government the ability to spy on its users. 2 weeks ago, there was the unprecedented showdown between FBI and Apple over a US court order that would have compelled Apple to dismantle the security on its phone, with the FBI changing its mind just hours before the court hearing. And each news story adds new fuel to an already well-stoked public debate about privacy online. What should be the proper limits and oversights on government surveillance in the digital age? What responsibilities do companies have to secure the vast treasure trove of personal data entrusted to them by their users? So on the one side, law enforcement and intelligence agencies tell us they need broader and more inclusive surveillance powers to stop cyber criminals and terrorists. That an internet whose backbone is built on strong encryption would become a fertile ground for crime. On the other side, technologists, security experts, and civil society warn us that we are sleepwalking into a surveillance state. The powers governments are granting themselves are vast and unaccountable, and without strong encryption, everyone is more vulnerable. Not just to surveillance by their own governments, but to cybercrime, foreign intelligence, and corporate misuse of their data. And in the middle are the big tech companies themselves, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Apples, performing a balancing act between their profits and our privacy. Between these powerful interests of governments and companies, it is the rights of ordinary people around the world that often lose out. But what can we do about it? How can we make sense of these debates and come up with practical solutions that build human rights into the architecture and institutions of the digital world we live in? So I want to make 3 points today. First, whilst armed extremist groups have increased their visibility and violent actions, the supposition that we have to choose between human rights and public security has to be challenged head-on. Many of you will have heard officials here in the US speak out publicly against strong encryption over fears of what they call going dark, a term used to describe the declining capabilities of law enforcement agencies to access the content of communications due to stronger encryption in everyday communication technologies and services. In late 2014, James Comey, the director of the FBI, dramatically stated, and I quote, "We confront serious threats that are changing every day, and I want to make sure I have every lawful tool available to keep you safe from these threats. Encryption threatens to lead all of us to a very dark place," he said. This is essentially an extension of the security narrative that started in 2001 and that has insidiously crept into every corner of our societies, that rights are expendable when it comes to the so-called war on terror. In the years after 9/11, the right to be free from torture was the first victim of this new security discourse, as justifications for torture began to creep in. 15 years on, and the latest victim is the right to privacy, as governments erode long-standing protections that were designed to prevent abuses of power, such as the requirement to demonstrate reasonable suspicion and seek proper judicial authorization before accessing the private communications of citizens. Sadly, it's also a distortion of the truth. The reality is that intelligence agencies have never had so much access to as much data as at this moment in history. Even with the vast capabilities revealed by the Snowden documents, they tell us they need more. It seems they believe that they're entitled to a totality of access into everybody's lives. The British Prime Minister David Cameron said this last year, and I quote, "We cannot allow," he said, "modern forms of communications to be exempt from the ability of being listened to," which effectively means that UK citizens need to get used to the idea that even if they're doing nothing wrong, the government may access their data. Now, we are often told that the general public prefers safety over privacy. But a poll that Amnesty conducted last year with YouGov, which covered 15,000 people from 13 countries across every continent, demonstrated that people do not want their government to intercept, store, and analyze their phone and internet use. On average, twice as many were against surveillance by their government, about 59%, as those who approved, which is 26%. Nearly 2/3 said they wanted tech companies like Google, Microsoft, Yahoo to secure their communications to prevent government access. Interestingly, the poll showed that attitudes to surveillance are significantly different when it comes to foreigners. Across the 13 countries, slightly more people, 45% on average, approve of their governments monitoring foreigners' phones and internet use in their country, compared to 40% against. So in a climate of xenophobia and fear-mongering, this is a worrying trend in the direction of profiling and discrimination against minorities. If you ask a Muslim in France right now whether they're worried about government surveillance, you might get a very different answer to most non-Muslim French citizens. That is why measures which allow the government to spy on entire countries or populations under broad and sweeping warrants are simply not a proportionate response to national security threats. Measures to undermine the security of the internet as a whole through weakening or compelling companies to weaken encryption that protects millions of people worldwide are not proportionate either. Governments have always had to be checked by public pressure not to overreach and abuse their powers. This is why we have laws. It's not the first time that societies have faced external or internal threats, and it is not the last. Governments must respect human rights in times of threat, or they risk abandoning the very values they claim to protect. So the second point I want to make is that I think it's crucial that we understand the global implications of actions taken in the United States and other what have been called open societies. As you know, frequently the conversations over data, privacy, and surveillance take place as if they only concern the citizens of the US and Western Europe. Less than 5% of the world's population live in the US, but the policies and practices of US technology companies impact more than 3 billion internet users worldwide. These individuals use the internet in so many different ways, from the transactional, credit cards, financial information, and health data, to the political, seeking information, informing opinions, and speaking out on issues which they care about. In each case, their personal data can reveal extraordinarily intimate details about their identities and beliefs. Without strong encryption, this data is ripe for theft and spying, whether from criminals or governments. This, of course, impacts upon everyone's right to privacy, but it also affects many other human rights. In particular, the rights to privacy and freedom of expression are often understood as mutually reinforcing rights. When people have a secure space to seek information, expand their knowledge, develop opinions, and express ideas, the right to privacy acts as an enabler to freedom of expression. The confidence to communicate our ideas and opinions, however controversial, is underpinned by the knowledge that we are protected from unlawful interference with those communications. Now, in many of the countries where Amnesty works, this is critical. In the past few years, we have seen an extremely harmful erosion of human rights protections that we have been fighting for and have been built up over the past 70 years. Just 3 days ago, we received reports from Ethiopia of a social media blackout, especially outside of the capital and surrounding region, where protests have been happening since November last year. Citizens armed with their mobile phones have been capturing evidence and reporting on the atrocities committed in the context of these protests using social media, especially Facebook and Twitter. Now it appears as though the government has decided to block access to these services, as well as mobile messaging applications such as WhatsApp and Wsdl, which we are trying to verify and investigate in more detail. We have the Malaysian political cartoonist Zulfi Anwar Ulhaki, also known as Zonar, who's facing 9 charges as we speak under the Draconian Sedition Act and potentially decades in prison for tweets he sent criticizing the judicial. There's also ample evidence that repression now has become as sophisticated as it is brutal, thanks to the increasingly cheap surveillance technology that is available and sold to repressive countries with virtually no regulation. Turning on webcams of phones and computers remotely, logging every single keystroke once a victim has been infected by this kind of spyware, every call, every conversation, file and email is in the possession of the attacker. Amnesty's contacts from countries as wide as Mexico, Saudi Arabia and the Gambia have described the crippling uncertainty and paranoia generated because of electronic surveillance and the convoluted steps that they must take to communicate with colleagues because they cannot trust their digital communications. Bahraini activist Saeed al-Shahabi, who was the target of government malware while living in exile in the UK, told us how he lives in fear, even though he's outside Bahrain, because he doesn't know how much information the government has on him or how it will be distorted and used to discredit him or to go after others in his network. We've also heard of cases of how the private material that is hacked from activists is used to out lesbian and gay activists or used to shame and discredit women human rights defenders in public spaces who then face backlash and violence from their communities because they do not conform to the so-called traditional cultural norms. Secure communications can even be a case of life and death to those who risk their lives to peacefully stand up for the rights of themselves and their communities. Amnesty documented in the last 1 year, again, at least 156 cases of human rights defenders who were killed. These were people who were killed because of their peaceful and legitimate work standing up for their rights of themselves and their communities. And this is why Amnesty International believes that encryption is a critical enabler of human rights. Without encryption, those who stand up to government oppression, corruption, and negligence, whether they are lawyers, investigative journalists, students, environmental activists, are simply unable to operate in a world of ubiquitous government surveillance. And that leads me to my third and final point, which speaks to the responsibilities of both states and companies when it comes to realizing this range of rights in the digital age. Of course, in international law, it is states who hold the duty to respect, protect, and fulfill our human rights. Since the Snowden disclosures, there have been a number of developments at the UN level, as well as landmark decisions in courts around the world that respond to state surveillance of communications in the digital age. There now exists significant legal authority to support the understanding that mass surveillance fundamentally undermines and violates the right to privacy. And yet, the spate of new legislation introducing mass surveillance powers continues. In 2015, countries including Pakistan, France, Poland, Switzerland, and the UK have passed laws or introduced bills which give governments inclusive powers to spy on electronic communications. In many of these new laws or bills that have been introduced, the most worrying provisions would force technology companies to collect and retain the customer's data for longer periods of time and in formats that make it accessible to security agencies. For example, a current provision in France may go so far as to impose fines and even prison sentences on companies who do not hold that data in ways that make it possible to respond to decryption orders and data requests. Now, even if this is not an explicit ban on encryption, if passed, it could have the effect of deterring companies from providing strong device and messaging encryption. So as states continue to show they can't be trusted not to abuse the intrusive powers technology gives them, companies have become the bulwark between our data and government surveillance, as well as the focal point for this debate. Following the Snowden revelations, 10 companies launched the Reform Global Government Surveillance Coalition, calling for the world's governments to address the practices and laws regulating government surveillance of individuals and access to their information. Some companies have gone further, implementing stronger security in their platforms and services and challenging government data requests in courts. Microsoft has launched 3 government lawsuits against the US government since 2013. And as we saw recently, Apple has not only challenged the FBI in court over a request to backdoor the iPhone, but they may well argue that if the San Bernardino phone has been successfully hacked by the FBI, they have a right to know so they can fix the vulnerability. But there are questions about how deep this commitment to consumer security and privacy will go, and whether this is enough to protect our rights in the digital age. At the end of the day, companies still have their bottom line. In some cases, their business interests happen to align with more privacy protection for their customers. Companies such as Apple want to be left alone from expensive and unpopular law enforcement requests, and so are taking steps to secure our data in ways that make it out of reach to both themselves and governments. But there are also the Googles and Facebooks who also want to be left alone by governments, but want to be free to access and use our data themselves. After all, strong mining and selling advertising based on the personal data of their users is their core business. That's why Amnesty International has started to call much more consistently for companies to bring their practices in line with human rights standards. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, alongside other legal developments at the international level, make it clear that companies have a responsibility to respect all human rights wherever they operate in the world. This responsibility exists independently of a state's ability or willingness to fulfill its own human rights obligations. Companies need to put in place measures to identify, prevent, and address human rights abuses within their global operations, which is what we call human rights due diligence. And if they do not, they could be responsible for causing or contributing to human rights abuses, and this can carry serious repercussions. For years, Amnesty International has investigated and documented instances where the operations of oil and gas and mining companies have led to serious human rights abuses, including severe pollution affecting the rights to health, livelihood and environment, for example in the Niger Delta with Shell, to forced evictions in Myanmar. In some instances, our research has contributed to legal action against companies such as litigation by communities. Most recently, we issued 2 supply chain reports linking companies to serious human rights abuses. One documenting the worst forms of child labor in Congolese cobalt supply chains, and that is linked to the lithium-ion battery that most devices have. And the other documenting forced labor in subcontracting chains in Qatar in preparation for the FIFA 2022 World Cup. Here in California, the Transparency in Supply Chains Act is a good example of where explicit legal requirements are placed on companies in relation to human trafficking and slavery. So the bottom line is that all companies are coming more and more under pressure to ensure that their operations are human rights compliant. Because of the critical role that tech companies play in enabling the rights to privacy and freedom of expression around the world, they may contribute to human rights abuses by governments or other actors if they do not adequately protect the data of their customers. And we want to see technology companies and service providers taking concrete steps to assess and mitigate against such risks in each jurisdiction where they operate or plan to operate. So as Amnesty International, we are spelling out the following 3 obligations for companies. Number 1, companies have a responsibility to provide an adequate level of encryption, where their products or services involve the storage, processing, or transmission of personal data. This should be the strongest level of encryption necessary to protect against identified risks. Secondly, companies have a responsibility to explicitly and clearly communicate to their users the level of security deployed in their products, as well as whether they can be compelled under relevant national law to make private user data accessible to the law enforcement or intelligence agencies. Thirdly, if a company receives a demand from a government which is illegal under local law or which complies with local law but would risk breaching international human rights standards, the company should challenge such requests and do everything that they can to respect human rights to the greatest extent possible in the circumstances. So companies have a responsibility to respect human rights, which means defending their customers' right to privacy, not only when it suits them, but in all situations. So we're standing at crossroads, and the trends I have just outlined are not headed in a good direction. These problems are only going to get more difficult for us in the years to come, as even more of our daily devices, televisions, refrigerators, and even children's dolls generate and leak personal data. So what can be done? So Amnesty International has more than 50 years of fighting for human rights. Freedom of expression is our bread and butter. But as governments adapt their tools and tactics for controlling information, Amnesty is also having to adapt the toolbox we use to fight back. One way we're doing this is to use technology in innovative ways to defend human rights and support the people we work with. Amnesty has decades of experience supporting human rights defenders at high risk, whether providing trainings, advocacy, or practically helping them to cross borders. Now we're looking at empowering them through technology. There's a growing range of apps and tools that provide strong encryption and anonymity in messaging and email, but for these to be adapted and effective for human rights activists, they must be accompanied by greater awareness about the digital risks. So as Amnesty, we are focusing on increasing access to security trainings and tools, as well as supporting the development of protocols for what to do when they are victims of spyware or have their accounts or websites hacked. As a movement, people's movement and organization, Amnesty International also faces many of the same threats ourselves. We always suspected that some countries might be trying to spy on us, but it came as a shock last year that the UK intelligence agencies had illegally accessed Amnesty International's private communications when they were forced to come clean after we and several other human rights organizations took them to court. That we were unlawfully spied on by the UK government on UK soil was a shocking revelation, and we still don't have any information about what they accessed, when, for how long, or why. Given the close intelligence cooperation between the UK and several other countries, among them the US, we are concerned about who else has spied on our private communications. We have, of course, taken them to the European Court of Human Rights to find out more. But this revelation has also helped us to innovate, working with an initiative called Global Leaks to set up an internal system so that our contacts and partners can share information with us whilst protecting their identity in the process. We're also looking at how we make use of the positive role that technology can play in human rights. For example, we work with activists to co-design and build a panic button app for Android that turns a mobile phone into an alert system with the touch of the button, a concealed button. The idea is to connect activists to their network in an emergency and provide local information, location information, so that lawyers, colleagues, family members can respond quickly. And technology, of course, goes much further than that. Even as we are conscious that it presents new risks, in the past few years, we've invested in innovative new tactics to document abuses, to hold those in power to account. 360-degree cameras that allow us to capture the devastation of battle bombs in Syria in virtual reality. The Alt-Click project, which invites Amnesty supporters to help us analyze large amounts of data, such as satellite imagery, by parceling large amounts of data, by parceling it up into discrete tasks and having people identify points of interest that may highlight the patterns of violation of the ground. And the Gaza platform, an initiative we launched last year that cross-references all available data, including social media reports, to build a detailed pattern of Israeli strikes in Gaza in the summer of 2014. The fact is, Amnesty relies on technology more and more in our own work, both to help us in our overall mission, and to defend ourselves and those we work with from intrusive surveillance. As we continue to adapt to this new information environment, it's even more important that we call on the companies who provide the technologies we use to live up to the promise of these platforms, that they continue to promote freedom of expression, access to information, and connectivity. So in conclusion, ultimately, these are issues that we are all invested in. They go straight to what kind of societies we will live in the years to come, about the kinds of protection and security we are building, the architecture and institutions of this new digital world, about what is at stake if we do not build these in ways that protect and respect rights vital to all of us. We must be clear that human rights do not have back doors. There are no get-out clauses when governments find that rights are no longer convenient. The slippery slope we are on is towards a world where mass surveillance is the norm in the US as it is in China, and where internet security is a race to the bottom. We must consider the logical conclusion when everyone wants you to have security except from them. Weakening the security that companies provide their users sets a precedent to all governments. That's why companies must do more to protect their users' privacy from unauthorized and unlawful government surveillance and build stronger encryption with their products. That's also why companies must be transparent. People have a right to know what happens to their data, what companies do with it, and how they protect it. Providing pages of dense and technical text spelling out the terms of service do not help people protect their privacy. The information must be accessible and clear. So in 2016, we will campaign for consumers to exercise the power they have and to push companies to live up to their commitments when it comes to transparency and privacy. There is a high cost if these companies do not do that. The human rights and security of millions of people are at risk, and governments will become increasingly unaccountable to their citizens. I want to just close by saying that the Stanford community has obviously a very vital role in getting tech companies in Silicon Valley to put people before profits in the battle for the right to privacy. Thank you.
I'm going to exercise my privilege as the moderator to ask a couple of questions, and then we'll turn to the audience for your questions. So one of the important issues you raised is the issue of the privacy rights of foreigners. And there's a real, I'm sorry, there's a real problem where it's very difficult as part of the democratic process for a country to take those rights into account. So here in the United States, our entire surveillance regime is premised on this notion that foreigners are different from American citizens and people with green cards, and that we're going to treat them differently. And correspondingly, that surveillance that takes place overseas doesn't need to be regulated like surveillance which takes place in the country does. We've seen how hard it is politically to get legal reforms which protect citizens. How much harder is it then to get legal reforms which protect foreigners who don't vote for members of Congress, who are not seen as having the same rights as Americans or the same considerations, and who as sort of a sense of this lingering sense of nationalism, people feel like it's the role of our government to spy on people in other countries just as they spy on us. So how, what's your thoughts about this distinction that many countries make between citizens and foreigners, and how do we move really from a conception of the rights of the people as being those of us who are able to vote and maybe also who live here, and the rights of people as a global community that requires privacy on the global internet?
Thank you, Jennifer. I think it's a good opening question. I think it's a certain paradox in the question though, because if there's one thing in the world which is truly global, it's the internet. I mean, if you think of all the things which have helped globalization or create a more global world, I know that China has created a certain amount of firewalls, etc. But broadly speaking, I cannot think of anything else more global than the internet. So I'm exactly in that one piece of architecture which is global. We're having a conversation as to how do you separate out the rights on the internet and online freedoms between foreigners and nationals. And I'm trying my best not to refer to the US elections. But I do believe that the world should be spending 2 years out of every 4 years discussing US elections, because that keeps us rather preoccupied with one subject. But I'm mentioning this because you said that political leaders, the kind of politics of this is what affects a lot of the conversation. We are facing exactly the same challenge in Europe now. So, but if you take a country like Lebanon, for example, which has got, out of the 4 million population, 1 million of them are refugees. So there's a point at which, who is a foreigner? There are many countries we've been struggling with this. So I'm not so sure that that's a legal or a technical question. It's very much a political question. And unfortunately, what happens is that in all of these things, the public security threat, the refugee question, etc., we have a complete lack of ethical leadership, which instead of helping define how the discourse should happen, everybody sort of veers towards an extreme position and tries to dilute the principled position to a kind of position of the lowest common denominator. And I think we should just challenge this. I don't believe that there should be any distinction between foreigners and citizens when it comes to online rights. I think there should be the same set of, what we always say is that necessity, is it proportional, is there judicial oversight? I think the same principles apply whether it's locals or foreigners.
So my next question is relates to the issue of what companies are able to do and what people can reasonably expect companies to do. So in the security world, one of the things we always ask is, why doesn't Johnny encrypt? And the answer we've always come up with is that people won't do anything inconvenient, like not one thing inconvenient, to even if it will protect their privacy and their security. And so we've started to look to the technology itself, to the companies, to the design of the software, to do the protecting for us, so that people don't, it's transparent to the user and people don't have to take any extra steps. But as you said, sometimes the business interests of companies and their interest in providing this service aligns with the user's security rights, and sometimes it doesn't. If you have a product that's based on advertising or making recommendations, or if you, I like to reference one of my favorite apps, which tells me when I'm in the store. It reminds me, oh, you're near the store, you need to buy milk. And I could never have milk in the house if it weren't for that app, but it works because my location is being ubiquitously tracked all the time. So how do we, given that those are services that people want, that there's a business interest on the companies to have this data, and that those impulses are away from being protected, what are we going to do? And you see this with the convenience of things. Like a lot of human rights workers, maybe more so a couple of years ago before Snowden, were using platforms like Facebook, which are not private, in order to do political organizing and stuff like that. It makes perfect sense because it's very convenient, everybody's on it, it works really well, the user interface is great, but the security stuff wasn't there. So how do we address this sort of gap between the corporate interest or technological ability to provide real security and the way that people in real life are using these products and services? What can we really expect from Gmail as opposed to a product from Whisper Systems?
I know there are many people in this room who spend a lot of time thinking about these issues, so I'm very happy also to have a cross conversation. It's not like, and these are very complex and difficult questions, so there's no simple way of answering it. I think, typically what happens is that in a situation where you have corporate non-accountability, we expect states to step in and create the regulatory framework, do the right thing. Now, unfortunately, in this situation, because it's the states who are actually wanting to survey, we're in this awkward situation where states who should be regulating are not doing it, and often they're hand in glove with the corporations. So, also on the one hand, you could rely on individual companies to do the right thing, and you could, I know for sure that there are several key leaders in the technology sector who actually believe in doing the right thing. But I think that's quite tricky for us to be expecting it to move on that basis. So, which is why I think this is one of those cases where we do need very significant pressure from ordinary people, both in companies and in governments, for the protection of privacy and for the protection of freedom of expression. And sitting here, it's about milk apps, etc. But as I said, if you're in Ethiopia or Egypt, it's literally the line between life and death as to how your identity and if your anonymity is disclosed, it could be a very, very risky proposition. But I'm sure there are others who might want to add as well.